Hello, I'm Christina Presenti from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and I'm happy to welcome you to the webinar, Effective Campus SARTs, Assessing the Work, Creating Buy-in, and Navigating Community Overlaps. This is one of many webinars you can find in the SART Toolkit at www.nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. This webinar is one of two related to campus SART work. Please visit the SART Toolkit to find the second webinar titled Understanding the Role of SARTs and Behavioral Intervention Teams, BITs, in the campus setting. NSVRC would like to thank the Office of Victims of Crime for their support and funding of this webinar and the entire SART Toolkit. We would also like to offer the disclaimer that the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed are those of the contributors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Again, I'd like to point out the website where you can find great information about SARTs, about campus SARTs, and that is www.nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. And that is where you can find more information about a deeper dive, more resources, and lists of subject matter experts. I'm so glad that our presenters could join us today, and we'd like to turn it over to Michael to start introduction.
Hi all, my name is Michael Blackman. I work at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. We'll have our contact information on a later slide if you need to get in touch with us individually. But to give a bit about my role, I work in student affairs. I oversee our student conduct processes at the school, our student support initiatives at the school, and I meet with the majority of the students who report experiencing some kind of sexual misconduct on campus.
Great. My name is Jill Dunlap, and I am the Director for Research at NASPA, Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education. Prior to joining NASPA, I have about 14 years of experience in student affairs work, primarily working with sexual violence victims on campus.
Hello, my name is Jessica Heredia, and I'm the Assistant Director of Care at the Sexual Assault Resource Center here at UC San Diego. I've been involved in this work for over 10 years, primarily in the form of survivor advocacy. In my role, I participate in a lot of our policy development revisions. I co-convene many of our response teams here at UC San Diego, and much of what I do is really about how to make policy sound and survivor-centered.
Hello, I'm Danica Wolf from the University of Missouri. I'm adjunct faculty in the School of Social Work and Women's and Gender Studies, teaching the domestic violence class, and I am the former coordinator of our Relationship and Sexual Violence Prevention Center and led our SART efforts there for many years. I have done education, prevention, and advocacy work with survivors in our community and on our campus for the last 13 years.
Great. This is Jill, and I am going to be sort of facilitating our conversation today. And I'm really excited to be joined by so many of my colleagues from around the country who are doing such important work on the ground and with students and supporting them as they've experienced sexual misconduct on campus. So we wanted to start by just talking about creating buy-in on campus with regard to SARTs. And especially considering the different roles that people come to the table with and different agendas, certainly, and talking specifically about working with law enforcement, health services, survivor advocates, sometimes Title IX coordinators, respondent services coordinators maybe, and so sort of thinking through who all might be on a sexual assault response team in a campus environment and how that differs a little bit from the SART teams that might exist in the community. So talking through what that looks like and the different, like I said, different roles that people come to the table with, but also even different vocabulary that people come to the table with. And this is something that's mirrored in community SART environments, but is something that exists in the campus environment as well. So I thought we might start by asking each of our panelists to talk a little bit about how, when we understand that not everyone will get along when they come to the table, how do we navigate that in a professional way and create buy-in for the campus SART in an ongoing way? And so I think I'll just start with Jessica, if you're okay with that.
Sure. So we had an OVW grant Back in 2009, and we had to convene our coordinated community response team. And that was really the starting point for what our SART, which is what we call our case management team here, began. One of our kind of core driving philosophies in building these teams is really relationship building. Who on campus, as far as who engages in this work, really is invested in it to see the response improved. And so we were really strategic about, okay, which police officer within the police department is really invested in working with us and not just drew kind of the short straw out of the bunch, right? And so I think that that's a really important piece when you're first initiating these teams is a lot of solid relationship building, and that was very helpful for us early on in problem solving and figuring out what the next steps would be for our team.
So this is Mike. I want to just give a couple of logistical things that you all can consider that might help establish some buy-in early on. So first is to start, if you're starting from scratch with one of these SARTs, consider starting with a planning team first. So your full SART might have more membership, anywhere between 7 to 10 to 12 members, but having a core planning team of about 3 to 5 people that you know are invested in the work before you just call together the full SART can be helpful in establishing credibility early on in the process. And you can think about your institution to determine who is best on that core planning team. You would want to assume that one of those folks is a wellness resource, probably a security resource, a student affairs resource, and a Title IX resource as a core group, but that can be flexible based on the structure of your institution. So what this core group would really want to do is develop vision and mission statements first, talk about goals, the leadership structure of the SART, how it runs. That way when you bring the entire SART together, you have a starting point, and you have folks that are able to get those folks to have buy-in before you bring the larger group together. You want to start with climate data early on. So when you're forming a SART, you want to have some kind of established metrics that you're looking at to help you build goals. And we'll talk a little bit about goal setting later on. But that can include things like looking at your log to see what kind of reports you're getting. That kind of climate data will help establish what is the main purpose of this SART. Are you trying to reduce violence? Are you trying to create prevention initiatives? Having a focused goal early on, established in that planning team, will assist. Another thing you can think about once the SART starts running is to have a Team A and a Team B. Many times people will have a very large SART team, upwards of 15 people. And depending on the case that's being reviewed, not all of those people will need to be in the room at a given time. So you consider having a smaller SART of about 7 people, and as needed, you can bring in people from different areas on campus. For example, someone from the academic side that might assist with any kind of academic questions that are coming up. So having that Team A and Team B will ensure that people feel like their time is being used wisely. The final 2 points I'll bring up is to consider having professional development opportunities, share articles among the group, have external presenters come in and talk to the group, look at webinars and invite people in the group to go to webinars so that they feel that they are getting something out of this rather than just contributing to the team. And consider, when you feel like your SART is well established, raising the institutional profile by having marketing, a website, tabling on campus, campaigns that advertise that this SART exists. Once you feel comfortable that you're in a good place with your team, ensuring that students, faculty, staff all know about the SART and how to get in touch with it can be very helpful in raising your profile on the campus.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. I really just wanted to highlight again the 2 different things that both Mike and Jessica raised about creating buy-in and not just including people that you think ought to be there, but really selecting people. And the idea of starting that with a planning team is a great point. So thank you for that. Danica, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jill. I really also appreciate what Jessica and Mike already shared, and don't have a ton to share, but what I think can be really difficult for us to hold salient in the day-to-day, especially when we're doing this work and we're working with different colleagues, is just to remember that we are all working with a common goal and mission. We're all here to help. We just have different ways of going about it, based on our role. And that truth, holding that really central when thinking about how to create buy-in can be really transformative when trying to form these groups.
Great, thanks so much, Danica. So moving forward to think about some best practices, I'm interested to understand a little bit more about what practices each of you might have utilized that has worked well in your experience, and are those things specific to the type of institution at which you work? So maybe a little bit of background about the types of institutions that you work at, and then maybe also if you could describe what your SART does. So I know some campuses are more policy focused, and Jessica, you mentioned that yours is, serves really as a case management team. So I think maybe understanding the difference between what that looks like on different campuses might also be helpful. So I'll turn it over to Mike first.
Sure. So the SAIC, the School of the Art Institute, is a small private institution of about 3,500 students, undergrad and graduate. And the SART on our campus is a bit more informal. It's a group of core folks that meet together regularly, and I'll give you some other institutions where you can look to this. You know, in my particular institution, we don't have marketing published. It's a much more informal structure, and our purpose is primarily to focus on response. There are separate committees that meet to do prevention initiatives and individuals that run prevention initiatives, and that'll eventually at times come up when we're meeting as a group, but our SART is focused primarily on response. So a couple of things that have worked well for us. So I talked earlier about establishing vision and mission statements. So the toolkit that you'll see has some tips on this as well. I would add to look at benchmarking as a key way to establish your vision and mission statements. A couple of institutions that we often look at that have good, clear practices on this would be the UC system, UC San Diego, Northwestern, Murray State. All of these institutions have some clear vision and mission statements that you can draw upon and integrate based on your particular needs. Another key area to establish a SART would be having core values. So I mentioned this before, and as Jill was just highlighting, SARTs can have different purposes. They can be primarily focused on response, prevention, they can do programming, they cannot do programming, they can do education, training. So you want to be really clear about what is the goal here. And that'll largely depend on what other resources are already on campus. So if you have a really robust violence prevention office that's doing programming upon programming, you probably don't need your SART to add to that. You might want someone from that office to be on the SART, but you probably don't need to duplicate efforts that are taking place. So you'll notice when you're benchmarking that some institutions have established really core values. Those can be things like preventing violence on campus, honoring privacy, working collaboratively. So that high-level value setting can be really helpful. And then once you feel comfortable with your existing mission statements and vision statements and your goals, as I mentioned before, you want to focus on getting them out into the community. So publishing them on your websites, including them in the student handbook or manual. All of these can assist in making sure people understand what the purpose of the SART is. Another thing that can be really helpful before I end on this particular piece is developing a strategic plan. And for those of you who have been in an institutional strategic planning process before, this isn't going to be new information, but for those of you who haven't, there are just some key things to think about. And the purpose of a strategic plan is to set some goals, look at areas that need to be improving with your SART, and make sure that you're all on the same page about what those goals look like. And ideally, you're kind of always in a strategic planning process. The typical process would cover about 3 to 5 years, and you're in the process, depending on where you're at in those 3 to 5 years, you're always either planning your strategic plan, implementing your strategic plan, or getting set up for the next one. So that assessment cycle is really important here. So consider core areas when you're strategic planning. So you don't just want to focus on all of the core ideas that set up your SART. You want to focus on what you really want to be improving within that. So that can be campus climate. It can be victim wellness. It can be having comprehensive resources offered to victims. And depending on what those areas are, you want to consider having different members of your SART be responsible for overseeing that particular area. So you have someone that oversees the campus climate portion, and they report back to the SART regularly about how that improvement is going, run goals, vision, metrics that they want to be improved upon by the larger SART. So delegating that is really helpful. And finally, when you're having a strategic planning process, what comes out of that is some specific goals and objectives. And the toolkit has done a really good job of giving strategies for goal setting, things like making sure they're measurable, attainable. These are all practices that the toolkit goes into in detail, and many folks familiar with the strategic planning process will be clear on. But what you're doing with the strategic planning process is setting clear goals that you can then measure over time. So an ambitious goal would be, I want to reduce the number of sexual assaults on campus, and your campus climate data might be able to show that. So you have a specific metric, you might want to say you reduce it by 5% over the course of 5 years. So it's an ambitious goal, but it's helpful in that it's measurable and that you have a way of measuring it and you can look at it over time.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. Danica, are there additional best practices that you can identify, and maybe giving us a little bit of background about how your SART functioned when you were in that role, and how that might look a little bit different, or how strategic planning might have benefited your process?
Absolutely. So I think that it is extremely important when working through a strategic plan with your SART to keep the assessment process in mind. I know that for some of us, that can seem like, where do we want to keep at bay, but really understanding what benchmarks we want to include in our assessment, and how can you help build space in your strategic plan to work toward achieving those goals. That was something that that was really effective for us when considering, what is the purpose of our SART. We have had a SART for many years because of the OVW grant and even before that. But as policies and practices changed, we wanted to be responsive excuse me, to the needs of our campus and the professionals around the table. So to give some background, University of Missouri is a relatively large state land-grant flagship university, so I'm using lots of jargon there, but basically, we're right in the middle of the state and looked to as a resource in a lot of ways, and entrusted with a lot of resources. We do have a dedicated intervention prevention center that has become much more robust over the past 6 to 7 years. And our SART primarily does work around response. And it was designed specifically to understand where a survivor or supporter may enter the process, and having those professionals around the table. So thinking through who might someone go to request help, we need them there. And of course that could be very, very broad, especially in a large campus, but, looking at trends, looking at where referrals were coming from, how folks were getting to the hospital or to our community agency, whatever that might look like, was really key, and of course helped with buy-in. And then as we went along, and something that was kind of central to our strategic plan, which I will be honest was very informal. So I'm just wanting to be really honest about that. We wanted to be clear that we would be checking in about how the process was going. So if folks were having a really positive experience in a place that they sought services, we would absolutely celebrate that. If folks were struggling or felt like they were being bounced around or whatever the issue might be, and someone else around the table received that feedback, this was also the place to share that information. And of course that, would need to be done delicately, but really keeping that central tenet in mind of we're all here to help was key for that.
Great, thanks so much, Danica. I especially appreciated your discussion about the strategic plan, and I think one of the things that some folks have also talked about in other spaces is tying that SART strategic plan to the institutional strategic plan. So again, to elevate the the level of work or the awareness of the SART work that is happening and tying that to the institutional strategic plan can be really helpful. And I also just appreciated you talking a little bit about the data that's available to SART in terms of identifying trends. And that's something that I think a lot of SARTs don't consider is, they get a little bit mired down in some of the individual cases and sort of forget to pull back and look at, okay, where are folks accessing us and how can we smooth those transitions from, one resource to the other. So thank you for that. Jessica, what sort of best practices do you have that your Campus SART has used, knowing that you've already been mentioned as someone with whom, or an institution with whom others might benchmark or look to as having some really great best practices in place?
Yeah, so UC San Diego is part of the University of California system. There's 10 campuses. Part of that system. We're a large public university with over 36,000 undergraduate and graduate students registered at our institution. But what makes our particular university somewhat unique, and this was a driving force for creating our SART, or our case management team, was we have 6 undergraduate colleges. And very similar to Christina, we kind of informally started meeting to figure out too many individuals were reaching out to the survivor once they were notified about an incident, and that was causing some confusion and, just asking more questions of the survivor and asking more of the survivor, and it didn't need to be that way. We needed to streamline the process. And so we pulled together this very small group of our advocacy center, our student conduct, one police officer, one Title IX investigator, and then a dean from one of the colleges. And one of the best practices that we didn't realize was the best practice when we started doing it was debriefing a case from its entry point into a reporting process to its completion. So if it went through any kind of criminal justice process or administrative process and there was any sanctions or not, but once that case was definitively closed with as it related to a process, we all sat down as a group and started talking about, okay, what went well as far as the process and how we all engaged in it and what did not go well. And those conversations really laid the foundation for us to change what we were doing. So much of what our group started focusing on was the touch points for the folks involved in a particular case, but also how long these cases were taking. So we wanted to look at time. We had one of our first cases that came through a Title IX process back then. This was in 2011. That just took way too long. And a lot of that feedback was given to the Office of the President, and that's why in 2015 you had the Office of the President create a sexual violence and sexual harassment task force for the UC system, and one of their main recommendations was to have an established case management team, which I'll keep referring to that because that's our SART, responding to these cases and making sure that they are moving smoothly through the process. So we have different metrics that we have to measure as a group. Much of it is centered more around the Title IX process now, and we're working to address that. But I think that it was really important for us to really just get this group together because it felt very disorganized early on and too many folks engaging with the survivor who had experienced the crime.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica. I also just really appreciate you saying it was a best practice, but we didn't realize it was a best practice until a little bit into the work. So thank you for sharing that. And then, Mike, I'll just transition back to you to talk a little bit about running a smooth meeting.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jill. So I think this, for some folks, again, may be obvious, but for some who are just new to this process, it may not be. So I wanted to just highlight a couple of strategies to consider in terms of logistics when you're putting these meetings together. So in general, I'd recommend starting more frequently when the group is just getting off the ground. Certainly with your planning team, and even when you call a larger team together, I would be considering either weekly or biweekly meetings, just to get the group comfortable with each other, establish, making sure everybody's on the same page about the vision, the mission, the goals, And then once your SART is really up and running, you can think about monthly or quarterly meetings. I think one thing that's worked well for us is that you have, maybe less frequent meetings, but you know that the group is kind of on call to get together if they need to regarding a larger issue or if something is urgent. And so whoever is coordinating the group has the ability to look at people's calendars and schedule meetings as needed if something is urgent. I think being respectful of people's time is really important. Cancel meetings when appropriate. So if you're running weekly meetings and you're getting into the start of the year and there's really not that much to talk about, just giving people a break is fine. I think you want to be cautious about doing that if you're down to quarterly meetings because you want to be really careful not to lose momentum. And one of the things that comes along with having respect for people's time is having a clear agenda in advance. So whoever is coordinating the group or whoever's responsibility it is to put an agenda together should come to these meetings prepared. I recommend whenever possible sending the agenda out in advance, sending minutes out after the meeting is done. That way folks that are participating can see that the person who's running the meeting is taking it seriously, and they should too. I think when reviewing cases, we found it helpful to actually have a PowerPoint of a specific case, so whoever's coordinating the meeting can lead a PowerPoint with information on the individuals, the complainant, the respondent when applicable, and kind of run down a case point by point. The more organized you appear to be, I think the more the group will have confidence in the work that they're doing and confidence in whoever is coordinating. Whenever possible, again, just like with the agenda, distribute PowerPoints in advance, make sure the group is aware, certainly, of confidentiality concerns, though, and is handling meeting agendas and certainly information about students appropriately, shredding information whenever it contains personally identifiable information rather than just putting it in a recycling bin. I've worked with coordinators that actually don't let the agendas leave the room. They distribute only paper copies and then collect them again after it's done because they want to be sure that those documents are being handled appropriately. A couple final tips about running a meeting. So I think one thing to do when your SART is early established is be really clear about what everyone's purpose is in the room. And a couple of my co-presenters have talked about this a little already. That way when you're running a meeting, you kind of have someone that you're looking to about a specific question. So if you're talking about a counseling issue, you're looking to your wellness rep. If you have a law enforcement issue, you're looking towards your campus security or police department representative. The more that people know why they're in the room, the more they feel like they have a purpose, and will keep the meeting flowing because you kind of know who you're looking to answer a specific question. I think it's important to regularly review data, either climate data, misconduct data, and we'll talk a little bit more about assessment in a bit. But pulling the group together to look at that may help people feel like they have a larger part in the institution if they're looking at data and not just reviewing cases. And then the final tip is just be clear up front about what language you're using. So people in different positions use different terminology. And folks, for example, in the Wellness Center may not be as familiar with language like complainant respondent. So I think you want to start the group early on by talking about what do different terms mean. Are we going to use respondent or are we going to use accused? Complainant, survivor, victim. There are subtle differences with these, so you want to be on the same page. Even a word like confidentiality is going to mean different things to different people. So I'd encourage you all to get on the same page early on about what terms you're using and what they mean to you.
Great. Those are such great points. Thank you so much, Mike. As we look forward, we also understand that Campus SARTs have a lot of competition with other committees, and the university is committee full, right? And so Campus SARTs may have been in existence for a really long time and may seem to be on autopilot. So I wanted to ask you, Danica, about how do you articulate the ongoing purpose of your SART, which speaks a little bit back to buy-in, but also, what are we doing to ensure that everyone is on the same page, as Mike mentioned, and continuing to invest in the team.
Absolutely, and this is probably one of my favorite things to talk about because this is where I feel like it can be a really great place to insert hope. So we all suffer from meeting and committee fatigue, right? On my campus, there is literally a committee on committees, and that is something that we can feel really heavy about, but, and this is where I get kind of Pollyanna, and I understand that, but we are all here to help. And not only are we responsible for connecting the humans at the table and connecting around our shared humanity, right, going back to that common goal. But it's important to remember that there is an actual human cost to not doing this well. So when we fail to communicate and work together, our systems fail to serve our communities. When we do this well and effectively, our communities can count on a more just and more easily navigable system. There's also, of course, the reality of compliance and liability, which may end up being the more convincing way to talk with leadership and those more difficult to engage stakeholders. So, I found that really trying to figure out how the people around the table like and need to be motivated and inspired to really show up authentically was a really effective way to kind of beat that meeting fatigue that we can all feel at one point or another.
Great. Thanks so much, Danica. I especially appreciate your comments about the committee on committees. So as we also think forward about the importance of SARTs, we would like to maybe talk a little bit about how SARTs are communicating the work that they're doing to the greater campus community. So sometimes I think these groups exist and there's really important work happening and involving stakeholders from across the campus, but that maybe outside people, the greater community, for example, or the student body, faculty, and sometimes higher administrators may not understand or know or be aware that this work is happening. And so I'm just curious for you all what you do to talk about the transparency of SART efforts. So I might start with you, Mike, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. So I would say, broadly speaking, there's kind of three ways to handle communication. In terms of what you're doing and in terms of data, statistics that you are reviewing with your SART. So at the minimal, you want to be communicating what's happening on campus to the SART. So that includes reviewing climate data. It includes reviewing your log. And by log, I mean the list of all the reports and their nature. So the first level is just reviewing that information with your SART. The second level would be reviewing that information with institutional leadership. So you can have a SART report that's distributed to institutional leadership like the provost's office, the president's office, to ensure that they know what's going on the work that's taking place. I would say that in my experience, most SARTs fit into the first two categories. But I have been really interested, and that includes us. We, I think, keep it within our institution. We certainly try to market available resources, but don't put out data to the larger institution, like the external community. Because that third level, which I am interested in, is that there are some folks that really publish reports about what is happening on campus, the climate, the log, so that their students have access to it, their faculty have access to it, and even external people that don't work with the institution could find it on a website somewhere. I think this is really interesting territory. We've really struggled because that type of information needs such context. For example, one really obvious thing is that, say you have a lot of reports at your institution, or a lot of reports about sexual misconduct. It can appear that there's a problem at your school unless there's good context. But we all know in this work that actually a lot of reports might just indicate that students feel really comfortable coming forward. And so it's hard to balance that. If you just put that document out without good context, it can make people really uneasy. And so I think that's why so many schools stay away from it. But there are some institutions that put that information out there. And I think your benchmarking processes can look to see what they are publishing. So what I would say in general when you're thinking about this is starting small. It's much easier to add more information than it is to take it away. So if you put out there how many reports are happening at your institution each year, and then something happens and it blows up, it's going to be really difficult to then go back and stop publishing that information. So I would really encourage you to go very slowly before putting information out to the community, and even to your institutional leadership. You want to get a feel for what's going on. And whenever possible, get in the room with people to give context. This is not the kind of report that you just want to email out to the chief of staff. Ideally, what would happen is representatives of your SART would sit down with institutional leadership to whom you wish to communicate and really give a presentation and context as to what this report means and how it illustrates the good work that you're doing. So like I said, I think internal transparency is really helpful. I think it's always nice to have a coordinator or a member of a team that can work with institutional leadership to make sure they know what's going on campus and what you all are doing to address it. That can help get funding directed your way, help create institutional buy-in. It certainly can be a challenge because it provides a lot of context or needs to be given with context. But whenever possible, I think it's ultimately helpful. But like I said, at the very least, I think your SART should be reviewing your data regularly. And again, we'll talk about assessment in a bit. But having folks look at an annual report or data and thinking about how that SART can respond to the trends that you're seeing can be really helpful.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. And I especially appreciate your point about institutional buy-in into the SART. We talked a little bit about individual buy-in into the team, but the importance of the fact that the institution is investing people's salaries and staff time into this group. And so getting institutional buy-in is one important outcome of sharing that work. Danica, I'll turn it over to you for some additional thoughts.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, Mike mentioned earlier the paper agenda being collected and kind of that piece of things, and that got me to consider law and policy when communicating SART efforts. For example, Missouri is a sunshine state or open meetings state and has been for 45 years, so certainly nothing new. And what we found as we were really figuring out how the SART was going to take shape, what we were going to discuss, how we were going to discuss things, how we were going to share information, it worked best for us to just not have terribly detailed agendas. There was kind of an agreed upon flow of the meeting. Here are the things that we are going to be talking about every single time, so that members knew what to expect, and we came to that together. But there was no detail given ahead of time or minutes provided after the meetings for confidentiality purposes. So I really love how Mike framed some different communication options and ways to package the information for more external communications. But I think thinking about that internal communication can be important, and then build both intentionally into those strategic plans.
Great, thank you so much. Really important points depending on where you sit and which state you're in with regard to the sharing of that information. Jessica, I'll turn it over to you for a little bit of a different perspective about transparency on this point.
Yeah, so thanks, Jill. So as, the member of our team who is responsible for holding the confidentiality of the survivor, this has been a very interesting kind of place for me to navigate through. I often think about how do we communicate our efforts to the actual survivor who's impacted by the crime or the policy violation that we're discussing. And for us, as the Advocacy Office, we're very transparent with the survivors that we're working with about this team. We request from them a signed release of information, and we explain our goal in communicating at the SART team about your case is to, one, confirm that we are working with you. And the reason why we request that from the survivor is because oftentimes there's about 30 people trying to get to the survivor and tell them to work with us. And so we frame it for them about, it's really about just making this less stressful for you. So that's one of the main reasons. Another one is that we can kind of get a sense of what are the next steps in the process or the case, or what other resources are available to you. We make it very clear that we're not communicating with the team about any of the actual experience of the trauma, the details of the particular case from the survivor's perspective. It's really about the process and where they're at and what they may need. So I think that that's a really important piece for folks to think about when they're developing their SARTs, is what is going to be your method or process for how you communicate to the individuals involved in these particular incidents on your campus. and to be very transparent about that, because you don't want to lose that trust from the students who really do want to work with you, but they want to also know where their information is going.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. That's something I think that is, again, a good sort of framing between the institutional level view of what we're doing with the information from this meeting and then the individual impact. And I can't agree with you more that there's importance in building trust with the survivor, that they know that their case is being discussed, and then conversely that they also know that they can get regular updates because they have someone who is on their team represented in that group. So thank you for that.
Jill, can I add one more thing? Sorry, just to be clear.
Sure.
Our team also has a representative from Respondent Services. And so that's, I want to make sure that it's understood that there's, that fairness at the table. But it's also another reason why we don't disclose a lot of particular details of what is happening for the survivor. So I think that that's important for folks, that if there's information that the respondent needs, to have a Respondent Services coordinator there to also ask on behalf of them and get information or find out what the next steps are as well.
That's a great point. Thanks so much. So then we've talked about how assessment and data is important. So we, understand that, oh, I went back too far. Oh no, I'm sorry. In assessing campus, does I'm sorry, I got a little turned around. Talking about SART's role in assessing the campus climate, and that we sometimes need to understand the data that we're looking at and be able to use that in terms of the work that the group is doing. So Danica, if I could turn that over to you to talk a little bit further about assessment, that would be really great.
Yeah, so I'll just get us, kind of started here. I know Jessica might have a lot more robust information to share, but, again, I think that we often leave assessment to later, right? It's just that thing that we need to do later. We're going to do that at the end of the year, or at the end of a 2-year kind of cycle, or at the end of our SART processes. But it's extremely important to include, campus assessment and how we might be assessing our own work and where we fit on campus, how we fit on campus, how we stay current up front as we build those relationships. So even as early as getting the group together, helping to identify those core people, all of that, and really looking at the health and well-being of our campus as a whole can be really important.
Great. Mike, I know you've talked about the importance of assessment and looking at data that's available to this group as they do their work. So do you mind sharing a little bit about how your campus does assessment with SART?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to start with something that every campus should have access to. Even if you don't have an assessment office or a climate survey or a way of looking at what's happening globally, you should all have access to what is happening, what the reports are on your campus. So however many reports you get a year, any kind of report, not just complaints, but reports that students come forward to say that they've experienced some kind of sexual misconduct or sexual violence, you should be able to look at that data. And I would recommend at least once a semester getting a group together and reviewing it. And that can often just be your SART. So some things that you could be looking for are demographic trends. For example, we noticed recently on our campus trends related to relationship violence with international students. And so we use that data to develop an international student training during their orientation. You can look at incident types. So for example, we noticed a lot of situations involving ride sharing in our study abroad programs. And so we've developed some specific trainings and programs around that. And then even things like location trends. Are you finding that a lot of students are experiencing sexual misconduct at a certain place, a certain bar, off campus, on campus? And will that call for you to work with that particular organization or area, whether it's a residence hall or some other campus building, to see what you can do to curb some of that. So even if you don't have larger data, which I'll talk to in a bit, you always should have this log. And pulling people together at least once a semester to go through it can be really helpful in making some improvements. And it can also filter into your strategic planning process, which we talked about earlier. So other assessment things that you can consider. So climate surveys certainly are, I would say, the most important beyond looking at the log itself. And you have many options to do this. Climate surveys are often captured in any online courses that you're acquiring of students. There are certainly organizations that do standalone climate surveys, or you can develop a homegrown climate survey. And I think what you really want to be looking at is longitudinal information. We're a small campus, and so we can see spikes in particular areas at one point in time. But when we notice trends going even just 2 years, certainly 3 years, that's something that we're going to pay attention to. And the questions that we often are looking at most seriously are, do students feel like our institution takes their reports seriously? Do students know where to go if they need some assistance around a sexual misconduct issue? Those are kind of the baseline questions that you can ask. However, if you did your work previously and had some core areas to focus on in your strategic planning process, your core questions might be different. And so establishing what the goals are of your SART and what the core areas that you focus on can help in framing what those key climate survey questions are that you want to be distributing to your campus. In terms of qualitative and quantitative data, so qualitative data, this was mentioned briefly before, but I think it's really important to speak to students that have gone through your process, particularly the ones that have engaged with the SART or the Violence Prevention Office over a period of time. So that's often students that have filed a complaint against another member of the community, or students that have just been supported by someone on campus for a longer period of time, assuming that it's not a confidential resource. But sitting down with that student afterwards, and not just checking in to make sure they're okay, but asking them intentional questions about what their experiences were can be really helpful. And it doesn't have to be a formal qualitative interview. It can be sitting down, taking some notes over coffee, and then relaying that feedback back to the larger group, looking for trends. And other quantitative things to consider, you can have a survey that students fill out after they've gone through a formal process or a complaint process. You can have a survey that they fill out after they meet with someone on your team or in your office. And if you don't have that capacity, I would encourage you to, if you don't have the capacity to do a standalone climate survey or any kind of post-conduct or post-intake survey, look around to see what other surveys are going on in your campus. If your residence halls are doing an EBI survey, or if your student activities or student leadership office is doing a NESI survey, sometimes you can add 1 or 2 questions to it that can really just briefly touch on the work that your SART is doing. And so even if you don't have the capacity to do your own survey, you may often have opportunities to tack on questions to existing surveys on campus.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. So in our final few minutes together, we thought we would talk a little bit about understanding the overlap between campus and community-based SARTs. In fact, some campuses steer away from using the term SART so that there is less confusion between the two. But I will turn it over to Jess to start a little bit to talk about the overlap and how you can function in both groups if your campus is a part of both.
Thanks, Jill. So we do, as the Advocacy Center of UC San Diego, participate in our San Diego County Sexual Assault Response Team. We have bi-monthly meetings that include the forensic office, the different crisis centers throughout San Diego, as well as the sex crimes unit of San Diego Police Department and the sheriffs. So we meet with them bi-monthly, as well as one of our detectives from our campus police department. And it's a really great meeting to find out what trends are happening within the community that may impact our population. So, for example, we have other major institutions in San Diego, including San Diego State, University of San Diego. And so we kind of get a sense of if there's anything that they're noticing that we need to be informed about to address with our student population. We're also a border city. So when back in the 90s, when a lot of the rave scene was happening. That was our county SART was a main meeting for us to get information about what they were seeing as far as drugs and sexual assault. And so that it's just been a very great relationship. On top of that, it's helped us to cross-train. So we presented at our county SART meeting about the work that we do on campus. We've been able to bring in the forensic nurse examiners to our student health to talk about what does a forensic exam look like and how do our student health providers need to identify when they should offer a SART. That's what we call our exams as well, so it's a little confusing. But we found that the relationships that we built with our county providers through the county SART have been just so valuable in so many ways, and activating even more resources for the survivors that we're working with, but also to just really inform the prevention efforts that we're doing here on campus.
Great, thank you so much. Danica, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about maybe a different model.
Absolutely, thank you so much. So we actually don't participate in our community SART. We do have a lot of community participation in the campus SART, and we are in really great communication with our local, so keeping in mind that I'm coming from the perspective of the advocacy and prevention kind of center. We have a lot of really great communication and trust with the advocates and practitioners at our local shelter resource. And so we definitely invite additional community partners to the campus SART table when appropriate and applicable. We know that everyone is strapped for time and all of that. And we do have the understanding that there are just simply not enough practitioners to handle the volume of clients both on and off campus. So really trying to do it as efficiently as possible is kind of our goal. The other consideration for us is that, with our Title IX office, our Title IX coordinator, administrator, whoever it might be, it was important for that office to not be a part of the community SART because especially just over the last few years, there has been an increased concern that, if the campus is involved, then survivors aren't going to have any agency over their experience and where things go and all of that. And so, really having that line clear of, on and off campus was important. Again, with the understanding that we do work together, we, do communicate and refer folks back and forth in a really responsible way. And then our advocates kind of have, capacity to do what they're able to and trust that the, on and off campus agencies are going to work together and communicate offline if needed outside of those meeting times.
Great. That's such an important point about the importance of communication if campus representatives aren't serving on the community SART, but knowing that there is a campus SART that's happening. So that's a really great perspective. Thank you, Danica. Michael, I'll turn it over to you to close us out on this slide.
Yeah, for sure. I think Jessica and Danica have both done a great job of just describing in general the differences and similarities between campus and community SART, so I'll just give a couple miscellaneous things to think about. So I think any member of your organization that is responsible for sitting down with victims, survivors, complainants, to talk about resources and options available to them should be intimately familiar with what the community SART referral process looks like. So many schools have a sexual assault dean on-call system or a violence prevention office. Whoever is that frontline staff that's talking to students about what they can do should know what a community SART does and what it looks like. So we've talked about having institutional membership on that SART. I think whoever is representing your institution at the community SART should regularly be doing trainings with intake staff to talk to them about how that community SART works and what it looks like to be referred to it. I also would recommend looking at your vision statement and strategic plan again. That will help distinguish what your SART does compared to the community SART. I would also consider, when you're thinking about who you have on your SART, sitting down with that person, whoever is your institutional SART coordinator, should sit down with the community SART representative to ensure that they understand what their role is on that particular community SART. I think in general you want to be really deferential. I really appreciated what Jessica said about just making sure the community SART knows what your institutional process is, and I think that is a good kind of baseline for the work. If someone from your institution is going and being very pushy on the community SART or confrontational with other members, I think it can really damage the relationship. And in my experience, it's a pretty delicate relationship, and so it's one that you want to have really well established. Final tip I'll mention is I really appreciated both Jessica and Danica talking about ways in which the community SART can engage with your institutional SART. So Jessica talked about having someone come from the community SART and do presentations. I've worked in institutions where there's actually someone from the community SART as a regular standing member of your institutional SART, which can be helpful. At the very least, I think you want a direct line of communication, which Danica spoke about. So depending on how comfortable you are, at least you want a direct line of communication with someone from the community SART. The next level, I think, would be having someone from the community SART poke by in your meetings occasionally to do trainings. And then ideally, if your relationship is good enough, someone will actually sit from the community SART on your institutional SART regularly to give advice, guidance, and help ensure that you have strong communication.
Great. Well, I want to say thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists today. We have put our information here, and we hope that we can be a continued resource to you if you have questions about any of the best practices that were mentioned today or campus-specific information. If you're working on coordinating your own campus SART and you want to know more about how to do that, or ask for resources from any of the experts that have been on this call, our information is here. And so we hope this has been useful information to you and that we can be a continued resource as you do this work, the very important work that you're doing in the campus setting. And I'll turn it back over to Christina.
Great, thank you, Jill. And thank you to everyone for presenting today. Thank you, Michael, Jill, Jessica, and Danica. We really appreciate having you. And again, I wanted to put up NSVRC's information. This is how you can get in touch with us if you need to. Our website is www.nsvrc.org. We're a huge technical assistance provider, and I really encourage you to call us or reach out. We're really happy to connect you with folks like the presenters on today's webinar if we don't have an answer for you. And I also want to highlight again the SART Toolkit. I know throughout this webinar, the presenters referred to additional information, and in that toolkit, it is a huge website with a list of subject matter experts that you can contact with tons of resources and more information in addition to what everybody shared here today. So I just want to say, again, a huge thank you to everybody who joined us on this call, and a big, huge thank you to OVC for allowing us all to be here. So thank you, and please feel free to reach out, and thank you for everything that you do out in the field.